Hi, this is CinePunk's Robert J. E. Simpson. Before you listen to this episode, I'd just like to share a content warning. CinePunked strives to engage in difficult conversations and connect with sensitive topics when appropriate. Today's conversation around fandom includes material that some may find difficult or potentially triggering, including a brief conversation around serious sexual abuses, harassment, and social and gender intolerances. Listener discretion is advised. This is CinePunked. This episode, Fanomenal. Hi, I'm your host, Robert J. E. Simpson, and welcome back to another CinePunked podcast. And I thought we've done an awful lot of film-specific stuff lately, and we've been doing some thematical stuff based around altered realities. But we've also been having a few conversations. Some of you may have noticed we've been having them on live streams, but we're having a bit of a conversation about fandom and that whole world that encompasses. Because I think for many of us, we're not just watchers of these films, we're also fans of these films. And I'm delighted to be joined today by our very special guest to talk with me about this stuff, Dr Bethan Jones. Hi, Bethan.
Hi, thank you for having me on the show.
It's a pleasure, and I've been wanting to have you on to talk to for such a long time. We've known each other, at least in the social media world, for years, which is one of those bizarre things. But now I finally got an opportunity, and I mean, for anyone who's not familiar with your work, you've been brought on because you basically write, I would say, almost exclusively on fandom. Is that a fair summary?
Yeah, pretty much. I started writing about fandom because I come from fandom. So I was involved in the X-Files fandom from 1994 when I first started watching the show, and that led me to doing the PhD. And then as I was doing the PhD, I was writing more and more about different fan spaces. And that kind of branched out into anti-fandom and things we perhaps don't necessarily think about when we talk about fans. But yeah, I've written a little bit about other stuff like crowdfunding and depictions of gender in science fiction, but the bulk of my work is very much on fandom.
Even something like crowdfunding surely is another sort of lens at which you're looking at a kind of fandom, isn't it?
Definitely. Well, yeah, partly because I started working on that because we were looking at the Veronica Mars Kickstarter, which was obviously fueled by fans wanting to see a new season of Veronica Mars. So there's definitely, I mean, the way I think about it and the way that I think we quite often see it nowadays is that fandom tends to permeate every aspect of our lives, including politics. So there's work being done on political fandom. And you wouldn't necessarily think of that when you think about fans. You usually either think of sports fans or, TV or film fans. But it's becoming more and more integral, I think, to parts of our everyday lives, which makes it really interesting as a kind of topic of study.
Mm-hmm. So one of the interesting things, so for anyone, we try and steer away from particularly dry academia, and one of the things I like about the stuff that you do is it's very definitely not in a realm of dry academia. This is sort of a fun space. I was reading one of your articles earlier today on 50 Shades of Grey, which was a delight because you actually, the way you even opened up that whole thing was from a very accessible, approachable, enthusiastic fan way, and it kind of it made a mockery of this idea that academia has to be, let's be honest, a bit dull. So thank you for that.
Oh, thank you for saying that. One of the things I try to do, and again, I think it's because I come from fandom, so I've got that background of engaging with the text that I love in sometimes quite critical ways, because fans can be really critical. But I want to open my work up to other people. I don't want it just to be academics reading my work. Plus, I've got a creative writing background. I'm a story writer, so it's really good to hear from an objective reader that actually, what I'm writing is quite accessible and easy to read. So that's really good to hear.
No. I mean, it's a delight, and I'm also aware that another one of the sort of the I mean, for me, one of the interesting things about how you ended up with your PhD was from Cardiff, wasn't it?
Mm-hmm, yep.
Was that you've went down the line ultimately of past publication as a means to do it. So
yeah,
I know this is of interest to a few people out there who listen, who are interested in sort of the academic side of things. I mean, rather than, you did start down the traditional
I did.
PhD route, but then
Yeah.
you've ended up doing it this other way. How, I mean, is that vastly different? How did you find that as an experience?
I really liked it. I kind of went down that route almost by accident. And I don't think my supervisor was entirely pleased that I went down that route. And I'm not going to name any names. But yeah, basically, when I first started the PhD, people were telling me, you do a PhD, you publish, you present at conferences. So I went, okay, then. So I did. And I started off looking at gender in the X-Files fan fiction. And along the way, I got really interested in anti-fandom, which I'm kind of hoping we'll talk about a bit later because it's fascinating. I love it. So then I started kind of, submitting to conferences and writing papers. And before I knew it, I was kind of less focused on the actual topic of my PhD by thesis and more kind of writing articles about things that interested me. So kind of eventually, my supervisor got a couple of promotions, moved to a couple of different institutions. I followed him. At this point, I was also working full-time for Welsh government. So I was doing the PhD part-time. And it got to the point that there were kind of family issues, which meant that I couldn't really continue the PhD. So I quit, I withdrew. And I was speaking to a friend of mine who works at Cardiff because I got my master's from Cardiff. And Cardiff have got this thing where if you graduated from there within a certain period of time, they will actually consider you for a PhD by published works. And I was like, well, I may as well give it a go. I've got nothing to lose, I've kind of accepted the fact that I'm not going to get a PhD, so give it a shot. So I did. Kind of submitted the application, submitted the 7, I think it was, papers that I was planning to use as the PhD by published works. What it has to do is still speak to a key theme or a key topic. You can't just take 7 completely random papers, one about anti-fandom, one about, the growth of Facebook as a political platform, one about crowdfunding, medical care, things like that. It has to be on a specific theme. And mine was on anti-fandom. So yeah, I collected them together, wrote a 10,000 words sort of introduction, outlining what is original about my work, how does it build on existing content, how does it advance the field, that sort of thing, and submitted that. And in many ways, I kind of found it easier because I was writing as I was going along. But more importantly, I was getting involved in debates and dialogues that were happening kind of in real time. The thing with a PhD by thesis, obviously, is that you spend a good sort of 3 years minimum collecting your data, reading the literature, writing up your 100,000 words or whatever it is. And it's, I'm not saying that is wasted, it's not, but you find that people may have published content that is relevant to yours or similar to yours while you were writing the thesis. Whereas the way that I did it, I was kind of involved in these discussions. So I could publish an article on anti-fandom and then someone else might cite that article and then I might cite their article in a subsequent article. So there's this ongoing dialogue, which I think really helps to kind of open up discussions within the field, but also means that the research you do for the PhD by published works is current, is amongst, the kind of most up-to-date stuff that you can get. So that's kind of why I did that. And for me, it worked really well. And I think as a model, it works quite well. But we don't tend to do it a lot in the UK. It's far more common in kind of other European countries.
Yeah, we don't do it because I remember looking at it myself at one point as a possible alternative to my own situation.
Yeah.
I have a PhD that I had to abandon and I've never gone back to it as much as I really want to. So looking at people like yourself who've been able to find that as a means to get that exploration out and also to do what is quite good work. I mean, but it is. I mean, it's.
Thank you.
But I mean, when you're doing that kind of work, you're doing that currency. I mean, you've published quite a lot.
Yeah.
Looking through your list of publications, the number of books you've been involved in. You're currently writing an X-Files book or editing an X-Files book.
So I'm writing a book about the X-Files. I'm co-editing a book on conflict, complicity, and controversy in fandom. And we have also we had like some really, really good submissions for the book. So we are also now doing a special issue of Convergence Journal on the same topic. So yeah, there's a couple of things I'm doing right at the moment.
I don't know how you find the time. I really don't. I'm always impressed.
I haven't got a clue.
I see your stuff come up and I'm always very impressed with like, oh my gosh, there's something else. Hi. So let's talk about fandom because I find it a really... Like, I think you've alluded to this already. I mean, it seems to be something that's an inherent part of our engagement with any sort of form of popular culture.
Yeah.
If you're an active participant, if you collect stuff, if you go, there is an element of being a fan there and sort of the rituals that are accompanied by it. As a place of study, it might seem a little bit left field for people. But I mean, how did you started off as a fan?
Yeah.
I mean, what was your fandom? And I know this because I've read your stuff earlier. So I mean,
so my fandom, which probably will come as no surprise to anybody who knows me, was and is the X-Files. So I started off, it first aired in the UK on BBC Two, which is where I first watched it, in sort of 1994. And at that point, I was already kind of a science fiction fan because my granddad read a lot of science fiction. So, you know, things like Isaac Asimov. So I was reading some of those short stories. And I kind of heard about the X-Files coming out and I took a really dim view of it. And I kind of went in with this kind of really like snobby mindset of, well, it's not going to be real science fiction. You know, I've been reading Asimov, that's real stuff. This is going to be some silly ghost hunting series, you know, which is kind of not cool to admit. I wasn't someone who was immediately going, yeah, this is going to be the next big thing. I was really like dismissive of it. And then I caught an episode, and I'm 99% certain the first episode I watched was Darkness Falls from season 1, which it's kind of been lauded as kind of being like a really like ecological like awareness raising episode. But basically, there's a group of loggers out in the woods somewhere, and they cut down this tree, and there's loads of green bugs in it, and they are they attracted by light or? No, they don't like the light. So when, you know, generators start failing and things start getting dark, these little glowing green bugs sort of enter spaces and then cocoon the loggers in these cocoons, obviously. And then Mulder and Scully go to investigate. And I watched this episode and I was like, oh my God, this is amazing. And I just kind of fell down the rabbit hole. And I've actually got, because I used to keep diaries when I was a kid. So I've got my 1994 diary, which is covered in drawings of the X-Files X. I've got various different slogans written on it. And there's an entry in there which says, Ma'am says the X-Files is just a TV show. What does she know? And I'm kind of like, you know, it's now at the point almost 30 years later, where I've got a PhD in which I talk about the X-Files. So it clearly for me wasn't just a TV show.
Love that. I hope you're using all this material in the book or in some of your writing.
I am, yeah.
That's brilliant. I mean, like it was a show that I also discovered. I must have seen it and advertised because I seem to have seen it from the very start, and then there was a point at which it went on to Sky, and I remember having to tape it for a friend every week. He was a horrible friend at times, but, you know, I ended up recording this stuff for him. Yeah. And somewhere around there, I drifted away, so I didn't get to see how it ended for another decade. And then I bought them all on DVD and watched them then. And then I did a big rewatch whenever lockdown hit. Yeah. In 2020, I bought the Blu-ray and went through the entire run. Nice. The entire run, plus Millennium, plus Lone Gunmen. Trying to do it in sort of broadcast order and the films. And then I have bought some of the audio plays as well, which I have yet to get round to listening to. I'm not saying I'm a super fan because I'm not. I don't have a Mulder and Scully standee anywhere, or cushions or anything else. Yeah, the amount of stuff I have is ridiculous. But it is one of those things. Like, I mean, it's nice to kind of know that there was obviously something about that show that was dragging us all in, and for me, I mean, do you know why it was for you? Because I mean, for me, I think it was the weirdness. I was quite into my weird. And like that pulled me in.
I think there was that. There were kind of a couple of different things that just converged at the right time, I think. One of the big things was the chemistry between David Duchovny and Gillian Anderson, who play Mulder and Scully. And it's really kind of interesting when you hear the sort of backstory for the casting, because Fox did not want Gillian Anderson. They wanted someone more like a kind of Pamela Anderson, like conventionally sort of sexy woman to play Scully, which just would never have worked. So Carter actually did kind of fight for Gillian Anderson because, you know, she was really quite young and inexperienced at that point as well. But you can see from the start the chemistry between those two leads just works absolutely perfectly. So there was that aspect of it. There's obviously the whole weirdness thing going on, because we'd already had, by that point, I believe, Twin Peaks had come in sort of slightly earlier before the X-Files. Obviously that is, you know, pretty weird with David Lynch. But one of the big things that the X-Files did, which other shows hadn't done at the time, was to kind of merge this narrative storyline, so the myth arc that you see throughout each season, with the Monster of the Week episodes. And that kind of hadn't really been done in TV previously. So you can kind of appeal to sort of one-off viewers with episodes like Squeeze, Ice, the kind of, you know, standalone ones. But then you can also kind of hook viewers with the myth arc. So there's almost like this sort of broad appeal by virtue of using these two kind of different like narrative techniques. And that is something that a lot of shows since have kind of picked up on. The X-Files was kind of one of the forerunners of this particular style of storytelling. And Fox never really thought it was going to be that much of a hit. I think they first aired it after it was some sort of cowboy show. I want to say something like The Adventures of Briscoe County Jr., but I'm not 100% sure whether that is the title. And that is the one that they were banking on becoming popular. But it didn't. The X-Files did. And it became, you know, this cult text, which I would argue now it's become a neo-cult text. Which is an article that I'm currently writing in relation to the X-Files. But it took off and it became absolutely huge, and it was this worldwide phenomena. So yeah, a couple of different things I think really kind of contributed to that success.
So for you, I mean, so this is the one that you cite as being your kind of big leap into fandom. I mean, I'm aware that you also were interested in certain bands and things as well.
Yeah.
So there's multiple fandoms are going on, but this is the one that has stayed with you.
Yes,
helped your career. My gosh,
I know.
And what sort? I mean, for you, how did you personally engage with that fandom? I mean, what was your kind of way of participating? Because I think this is the thing that a lot of people maybe don't realize that they're doing, is in how they participate in the fandom. Because it's, I mean, I suppose it's enough just to watch something, but I think it's when you start going beyond. So I'm interested in your beyond.
Yeah, so I think there's kind of two different things, and being a fan and being involved in fandom aren't necessarily the same. So you can be a fan of something and never engage with other people. It's when you're in fandom, so, you know, you think of the term kingdom, fandom is similar. It's kind of this group, this collective, this community or whatever. And fandom nowadays, not so much in the behaviours, but certainly perhaps in the access points, is quite different to when I was a kid and when I was first a fan of the X-Files, because I didn't know the internet. So I would watch the X-Files on a Sunday night on BBC Two, and then I'd talk about it with my friend in school the next day, because one of my friends was a fan and my English teacher was also a fan. So those were the only two people I would talk about the show with. But, you know, it'd be like, oh, did you see it last night?
It's a really exclusive club, isn't it?
It really was. I also started writing fan fiction, which I wrote, you know, longhand in like a exercise book.
And this is pre-internet fan fiction? This
is pre-internet, yeah.
So without having that kind of ability to...
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it was literally just, it was because we got the internet... Actually, I got hold of the internet in school when I was probably about 16, 17. And the reason I remember this is because I went up to the Hay Festival as part of something called the Beacons Project. And in one of the rooms, they had these kind of different, really old school computer setup, so big CRT monitors. And the first thing I did was go onto AOL online and search X-Files to look for X-Files chat rooms. So that was the first thing I did when I got hold of the internet. But before that, I didn't have it. So all I had literally was like a pen and paper, my imagination. And my English teacher, so I'm from Wales, I went to a school in Wales, and we have annual Eisteddfods, which are kind of creative events where you kind of write poems, write stories, maybe like perform dances, perform songs, things like that. And one of the story prompts that my English teacher gave us for that Eisteddfod was write a story about Mulder and Scully. So my first piece of fan fiction was Mulder and Scully came to Aberdeen and they were investigating UFOs or ghosts or something in the woods near my school. And me and my sister went and helped them. So it was a massive Mary Sue self-insert fan fiction featuring Mulder and Scully.
Brilliant.
And then so from there, when we got the internet at home, I discovered the BBC cult message boards, which sadly no longer exist.
No, yeah.
But they were amazing. So I joined these forums and talked about the X-Files with other people, people I didn't know, people who were on the internet, but were still fans of the same show as me. And I kind of, wrote and published fan fiction on those boards, which I still have on floppy disk, but I've got no way of reading the floppy disk, so I don't know how bad they were.
Small mercies, eh?
Yeah, I know. So that kind of spiraled. And at that point, internet fandom, I think we all are kind of fairly common these days. We're all probably used to it. And that's one of the ways, like I said earlier, about fandom being part of our everyday lives. I think the growth of the internet and technologies like smartphones really mean that we can engage with our fandom at any point in time. So if you like a band page on Facebook and you're scrolling through your Facebook and a post pops up, you are engaging with that fandom. So you're not having to go to a specific place like the BBC cult message boards in order to talk to people. You kind of almost get it delivered to you within the context of your everyday life. So that is kind of, I think some of the ways that access points to fandom have kind of expanded. And the way that we consider fandom now is very different to the way media fandom particularly was considered in sort of the late 80s, early 90s. Back then you were just a single geek living in your parents' basement and who couldn't get a girl. That was kind of the view of science fiction fans.
I'm pretty sure that's still me, to be honest. I don't think that's changed.
Oh, I don't know. We've now got things like Marvel, airing preview trailers at Comic Cons and things like that, and it's become a massive industry as well.
Yeah, I mean, certainly it's a lot easier to find your tribe than it used to be. I'm a similar age to yourself, so I mean, a lot of it's I remember in the 90s, it did feel much more remote.
Yeah,
that it was in school that you maybe find a couple of people who were into the same stuff. I set up a Doctor Who society when I was at school.
Awesome.
And that was the 90s when it wasn't cool. And we got mocked mercilessly for it, which meant that a lot of people would just drift away. And I still proudly wore my badge every day. But I mean, that was hard, and fandom was at such a remove. There wasn't the same access to groups and events. And also, Northern Ireland in the 1990s, people didn't come here. So for me, fandom was always so much more remote. It was only when the internet came in that, like yourself, the cult forums, I don't think I engaged in too much.
Yeah.
I remember finding a group of Buffy fans and writing Buffy fan fiction on, I think it was One List for a while. And then I found the Hammer fandom, which ended up sort of being a career for a while, in a completely unexpected manner. But by the time you get to the 2000s, everything changes and everything is so much more accessible. Massively so. So, I mean, I'm also wondering, one of my constant questions, and we talk occasionally about this, is about how that is now controlled as well, the sort of the gatekeeping mentality that exists around fandom. I mean, in the past, as somebody who's engaged in fandom, you obviously have people who produce content and people who consume content, and it felt very, it was quite binary in that sense. Yeah. Whereas now every Tom, Dick and Harry is producing some sort of content if they're engaging with the fandom.
Yeah.
Everybody's doing memes. I see less of the fan fiction, although I gather it all still exists. I just don't go in those places anymore.
Yeah, it kind of moved. So fanfiction.net was one of the big spaces for fanfiction back in the day. What we have now is Archive of Our Own, AO3, which is a really interesting platform because it is linked to the Organisation for Transformative Works, which is an organisation kind of set up to, in some ways, sort of protect transformative works, so fan fiction, fan art, fan video, stuff like that. They've kind of got a legal arm because there have historically been various legal issues with fan fiction and fan vids in terms of copywriting. But they also have the Journal of Transformative Works, which is an academic, open access, peer-reviewed journal that publishes work on fan studies, which is where I've published. So it's a really interesting, it's kind of, for me, it's interesting that this umbrella organisation, the OTW, has this fan fiction arm to it, and then also this academic arm to it as well. And AO3 it is now huge. There's a lot of fanfic being published on there in various different fandoms.
And qualities.
Yes. Yeah, I think AO3 tends to skew, although this might be my bias because, you know, I only read in certain fandoms, so it tends to skew perhaps a little bit better than the fic you might find on fanfiction.net or Wattpad. But, you know, as with most places, there is going to be some really good quality stuff and some less good quality stuff.
I see, and this is a game where I think the kind of gatekeeping comes into things. This idea that there are certain people who decide what shouldn't be allowed in terms of fandom, in terms of how we access that fandom, and in terms of who has the right to an opinion on that stuff. And I don't know. I have such mixed feelings about it myself as both a content producer and a content consumer, because I know the need for editing and somebody to kind of have a bit of sense. Yeah. But at the same time, in terms of fandom, the last thing you want to do is to exclude anyone from being able to engage in something that they love and they enjoy. Yeah. So it's kind of, I don't know how I feel. I don't know. I mean, grief, I hope I'm never a gatekeeper, but occasionally I do feel like certain people shouldn't be allowed near a computer.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't think I would disagree with you in that respect. And it's interesting kind of being an academic study in this as well, because, and I'm going to use Twilight as a key example because it's fascinating. So Twilight, I imagine most people listening to this are familiar with it, but it's a series of young adult books written by Stephanie Meyer about this unassuming girl who moves up to Washington State to live with her dad, and she meets this guy who's a vampire and meets this guy who's a werewolf, and there's this whole love triangle thing going on. And it is right. So with my academic head off, just going to caveat this.
Bethan the fan now. Is that what
this
we're
is
talking
Bethan
about?
the fan. Okay. This is specifically Bethan the anti-fan who hates Twilight. I think it's badly written. I think it kind of reproduces these just ridiculous tropes that paint essentially stalking and kind of sexual harassment as romance. It's got, I think, some really not great views about sex and sexuality, which kind of isn't a surprise because Stephanie Meyer, who wrote it, is or was a Mormon, so she is, you know, going to be obviously influenced by that religion. And I think it's just horrendous. And as someone who does kind of watch vampire texts and as someone who loves Buffy, like, vampires do not sparkle. That does not happen. So kind of with my non-academic head on, I'm like, this is an awful text. Like, I hate this text for many, many, many different reasons. But with my academic head on, it's actually really fascinating because Twilight as a text allows sort of young girls in particular to perhaps explore their own sexuality. They're being kind of exposed to a very safe relationship, essentially. And they get to kind of almost sort of live vicariously through Bella. And kind of, see what happens with these two different guys, with Edward, with Jacob. And it's also fascinating because the discourse around it is very gendered. And as with most things, Twilight fans are ridiculed because they are generally female. So there's these huge discourses that came out both when the Twilight books were published, but also when the films came out. And you had Team Edward and Team Jacob, and you had fans kind of squeeing over Robert Pattinson and various other actors. And these fans, predominantly the young female fans, were painted as like hysterical, over emotional. They were these really like 18th century gendered terms being used to discuss these fans and this particular sort of fan behavior. And that's fascinating because I'm like, well, that is such a key instance of gatekeeping. So you have, and there's a couple of other examples. So when Twilight went to Comic-Con, they were all of these sort of grown men be like, Twilight is ruining Comic-Con. You've got all these girls coming into this space. And it's like, dude, seriously, this is not a space just for you. But there was kind of uproar. But also Muse, the band's music was used quite a lot in the Twilight films. So you ended up with a lot of Twilight fans joining the Muse fandom because they'd heard of them as a result of the films. So then you've got all of these Muse fans being like, oh my God, Twilight fans are taking over our space. They're not for Twilight fans. They're not for you. They were cool long before Twilight existed. We don't want you in our spaces. So they're like these really clear examples of gatekeeping. You see, predominantly in Twilight, but in tons of other examples of media texts. And a lot of it is related to gender and race. The 2016 Ghostbusters is a prime example of that. And it was horrendous seeing a lot of the discourse that was kind of being, spread on social media sites when that first came out.
And still continues to do so, to a point that, I mean, I'm one of those people who actually quite enjoys that film. I apparently have bought it 3 times now on Blu-ray for some reason. I do not know why I've ended up with 3 copies of it, but I have bought it 3 times. And I have watched it multiple times, and I get a lot out of it. Yeah. And I don't get that sense of... I don't know why people have persisted with this attitude that was pre-written before the film even came out. Yeah. I mean, a lot of the people who've criticized it still haven't seen it. Yeah. So, I really don't care what you think because you haven't seen the film. And also, in case they haven't noticed, all the fucking original stars are in there. They've all endorsed this thing. Exactly. Give it a chance.
I know. It's crazy. And it kind of, there was this whole discourse of, Ghostbusters reboot ruined my childhood. And on the one hand, I'm like, yeah, I understand as a fan how attached we can become to these texts, and they will have specific meaning for us. And, if people criticize that text, it can feel almost like a personal criticism because you love that text so much. But at the same time, I'm like, if a remake or a reboot, even, it's not even a remake, a reboot of a film you loved as a child, sort of 30 years later, is ruining your childhood. How insecure do you have to be? And if that isn't a performative statement, which in some cases I'm sure it was, just this performance of disgust, seriously, how insecure do you have to be that this remake, which is aimed at a totally different audience, is ruining something from your childhood? It's weird.
So, I mean, I'm aware on Twitter you're Memory's child. So, yes. We're actually just, I don't know if that has any correlation with this at all, but it strikes me that a lot of this is, we're talking about fandom and memory. Yeah. And that sort of association. I mean, how much of fandom do you think our connection with those sort of nostalgic, emotional things? Because I'm aware, especially over the last 2 years, a lot of folk who maybe haven't previously have gone and absorbed themselves in nostalgia. As I've said, I went and rewatched the entire X-Files and loved it. I'm currently doing a rewatch of the modern Doctor Who for the first time. And then the last couple of days, I discovered the new Fraggle series, which is creating all kinds of weird mixed nostalgia for me because I don't have I have great impressions of the original series as a kid, but I haven't rewatched it since then. And like I've got to the end of the first episode now, we tears down my cheeks. I mean, it's hitting something for me.
Yeah.
But I mean, for you, like, what are your thoughts on this? And I mean, how much of fandom is for you a nostalgia, or is it tied into memory?
It's a really, really good question. And there's sort of a couple of different but maybe linked answers. My username actually comes from a song that was used in the 2008 X-Files movie. So there is that link again to my fandom. But there is more and more work being done on nostalgia in relation to fan practices. So thinking again, about the X-Files and Twin Peaks, when both of those revivals came out, I conducted like really extensive research. So I did a couple of different surveys with viewers, with fans. I had something like just under 3,000 responses. So like there were a ton of people that wanted to share their opinions. But what was really interesting was the amount of people who talked about the texts in relation to their childhood or in relation to kind of the first points at which they watched it. And I kind of actually ended up giving a conference paper. It was at the start of last year, looking specifically at nostalgia, because it was a huge part of the revivals, not necessarily in the reasons for the revivals to be kind of greenlit in the first place, although I'm sure that had an element of it. That if you revive a previously kind of successful, popular franchise, you're going to make money off it. That's kind of a given these days. But it was interesting that a lot of people, they were talking about watching the revivals in relation to how they engaged with fandom back in the day when, we didn't have Twitter, we didn't have Facebook, we couldn't interact with, David Duchovny on Instagram or Gillian Anderson on Twitter. And there were some really kind of interesting points when people were like, I was like a teenage fangirl again. I went back to this period in my life where I was fully absorbed in this fandom. And, for the hour that this was on and, for the half hour afterwards where I was engaging with this text with my friends online, I was again a teenage fangirl. And that was really interesting. And there were other points where people were talking about, well, actually, when I first watched the show, I watched it with my friends and, 15 years later, they passed away. So it's really bittersweet. I'm watching this now and I'm thinking of when I used to watch this show with my friend. So it's taking people sort of back into different times and spaces of kind of their childhood and of their history with these texts. And I really want to do some more work on it. I want to write a book about fandom and nostalgia, to be honest, because it's really, really interesting. And I think there's a lot of stuff that can be sort of uncovered, particularly in relation to other work that's been done about fandom and the life course, and kind of different entry points to fandom, exit points, and then re-entry points. Because what you'll find is, your fandom quite often goes like that. It's not kind of I join the fandom and then this is my level of fanish engagement for the rest of my life. So I think there is, particularly with revived series, definitely this sense of nostalgia. And sometimes, like over the pandemic, I rewatched a load of stuff. I rewatched Buffy. I rewatched, I've forgotten the name of the bloody show. I rewatched Castle. I rewatched Friends. And there's a sense of comfort, I think, in some respects with watching those, especially in the middle of a global pandemic when, no one knows what the fuck is going on and everyone's kind of just terrified about what the next day, the next week is going to be like. So there is a sense of kind of comfort in going back to these texts that we loved when we were younger. And also knowing how they turn out. I'll still rewatch the X-Files, even though at this point I know some of the episodes word for word. So I'm literally there kind of like speaking along with all of the characters because I've seen them so much. But I still love them and I still laugh at various points because I know what's coming up. So there's that kind of anticipation involved as well, but it's anticipation because I've seen it so many times before. So there's kind of really interesting things going on. And because of the way that fandom functions in terms of like communities and stuff and families, I think there is a lot of these texts that we do end up kind of relating back to points in our lives that were particularly important or memorable for whatever reason. So we kind of have these fandoms almost as tethers to our past for whatever reason, which obviously doesn't negate the fact that those fandoms and our feelings towards them might change over time. But there is this kind of strong linkage, I think, to memory and to nostalgia that we see coming into play with some of these fandoms.
So it's move on slightly from this, because this is all fascinating, but I also know that one of the things that interests you, and actually I mean interests me as well, is this sort of realm of anti-fandom and also I think toxic fandom. I think yes. I think the two things probably they're probably the same thing in many respects. I don't know, maybe you feel differently about that. I definitely think they're very close bed partners, if nothing else.
Yeah, there are a lot of similarities between them, but I do think they are two distinct things as well.
So you have written quite a bit on anti-fandom rather than toxic fandom, I think. So anti-fandom, can you explain that for somebody who doesn't understand what that term is? Because I'm sure there are folks at home who are going, what's anti-fandom?
Yeah. So it's a theory that was first proposed by Jonathan Gray back in 2003. And he published this article where he pointed out that if we're looking at audiences, and in looking at audiences, we focus on the fans, we lose a lot of meaning because we are not looking at the people who actively dislike a text or kind of aren't really bothered one way or the other. And that makes a lot of sense. So he kind of proposed this idea. So there are fans who we are familiar with, they love the text, they engage with it in different ways. They might be part of fan communities. There are non-fans who might, watch something when it's on telly, but not be particularly bothered if they miss it. We might also call them sort of casual viewers. So they don't really engage in any particular like affective response, either in a positive way or a negative way. And then there are anti-fans. And in Gray's first sort of iteration of anti-fandom, they were people who kind of actively disliked a text. They were bothered by it. And you could be an anti-fan without ever having watched the text.
This is Ghostbusters fans again.
Exactly. So what we have is paratext, which are things that exist around the text itself. So you've got the X-Files, that's the text. But in terms of paratexts, we've got interviews with Chris Carter, Duchovny, Gillian Anderson. We've got trailers. We've got fan fiction on kind of the unofficial paratext side. We've got behind-the-scenes commentary on DVDs. There's, pre-release reviews from people who've, seen the first episode of season 10 before it was on general release. So all of these things work to build up a picture of that text in people's minds. And some people will be like, oh my God, that sounds amazing, really interested. Other people will be like, oh my God, this is science fiction, I hate science fiction, it's going to be shit. So they've never engaged with the actual X-Files in this instance. They've never watched an episode. But they are using those paratexts and their understanding of the genre to be like, this is something I'm never going to like. So that was kind of the real genesis of anti-fandom. What's really interesting, I think, is that has always been a part of fandom. It's just never really been theorized in that way. So when Henry Jenkins published Textual Reporters in 1992, it's like one of the key fan studies texts. And he points out that fandom is a mixture of fascination and frustration. Fans are fascinated with the text, but they also have some frustrations with it. And that's why people, write fanfic or create fan videos and stuff. But early work in the field was very much looking at the positive side because fans were seen as weirdos. So there was like an actual attempt to portray a slightly more positive picture. But then Gray comes in sort of 2003 and builds up his work, builds up these definitions of anti-fandom. And there are different reasons why we might dislike a text. Anti-fandom as a behaviour, though, kind of goes a bit beyond like disliking a text. So much the same as fandom goes beyond liking a text. If you're a fan, you will engage with it in some way. You'll tweet about it after an episode, or you write fan fiction, or you'll join Facebook groups and stuff like that. Anti-fandom can function in a very similar way. So you will have people who hate watch films or TV episodes and then blog about it. You will have people who hate read 50 Shades of Grey. And there was a whole YouTube series about kind of someone hate reading 50 Shades of Grey. Sounds
like a bit of sadomasochism in its own right.
A little bit, yeah. And you can see this. So there's various communities. There was one community, I think, was on LiveJournal called Twatlight, which was kind of a Twilight anti-fan community.
Right.
There are people who've posted memes saying, I'm reading Twilight, so you don't have to. So there are all of these practices which are very similar to fan practices, but kind of at the opposite end of the spectrum. And that is what I find really interesting. And the reason I find it interesting is because of my X-Files fandom. Because when I started writing fanfic, I found Diana Fowley as a character really interesting. She was introduced sort of end of season 5. She was kind of brought in as this sort of love interest for Mulder. She had been involved in setting up the X-Files before the show actually existed, sort of before we see the pilot episodes in season 1 and stuff like that. Most fans hated her, legitimately wanted her to die in horrible, painful ways. And there's a lot of fan fiction which is basically Fowley being killed off because fans hated her. And I'm like, this is really interesting. As a character, she's kind of written in quite a similar way to Scully, and people are going to hate me for saying that. But some of the things that Scully is kind of subject to because of her gender, Fowley is also kind of subject to. But fans would rewrite those stories with Scully. They wouldn't with Fowley, they'd kill her off. And I was like, this is fascinating. I tend to write a lot of Diana Fowley fan fiction because it's really interesting. So that's how my interest in anti-fandom kind of developed. And I'm really intrigued in understanding sort of why people hate these texts, the way that they perform that hatred, the different kind of fanish behaviours. And then that has extended out into things like racism, sexism, misogyny, harking back to Ghostbusters again. Ghostbusters anti-fandom does actually draw on these really harmful and in some cases quite violent discourses around race and around gender. And that I find interesting because it kind of in some ways goes beyond the kind of acceptable fanish behaviours, and it ties into all other discourses relating to kind of our society and our culture.
So I mean, it's interesting because I'm aware of elements of this, and having encountered a lot of it, I think I've probably chosen to not engage with a lot of those kind of mindsets and communities that exist. So I feel like there's an ethnographic exploration that probably needs to be done to understand this, and I don't know if I'm quite ready to go down that pathway and to sail into that country. But so when you have that kind of that very negative space that exists out there, I mean, how much of that is something that's endorsed and permitted by the fandom?
It varies.
Because obviously, if you're talking about when you're talking about something like that particular fan fiction about that character, that in itself also sounds like, whilst it's anti-fandom, it's also coming from a fandom mindset.
Yeah, totally.
So it's anti-fandom isn't even separate from fandom. It's
on that spectrum. What Gray calls anti-fandom and fandom like a Mobius strip. So it's it's almost the two different sides of the same coin. And you do get anti-fandom within fandom. So one of the kind of key examples is you're either a Star Wars fan or a Star Trek fan. You can't be both. If you're a fan of one, you immediately become an anti-fan of the other. And we see that in sports a lot. So obviously I've been watching the Six Nations at the moment because the rugby is on and I support Wales. So as a matter of course, I do not support anyone who plays Wales. So by virtue of being a Wales fan, I'm an anti-fan of all of the other Six Nations rugby teams. So we see that does exist. It is, like I said, that kind of spectrum of fanish behaviours kind of goes from fandom to anti-fandom on the other side. And it does get endorsed within fandom. One really interesting example is One Direction fans who, there was this whole intra-fandom conflict between those who shipped Harry Styles and Louis Tomlinson, also the portmanteau known as Larry Stylinson, and the fans who really opposed that ship for multiple reasons. But yeah, it kind of escalated into like these Twitter wars with death threats being thrown around and things like that. So it very much exists within fanish spaces, as well as existing kind of maybe on the outside of fandoms, or kind of directed at particular fans of certain things by maybe the dominant fan group or a very vocal minority.
Is it a tribalism? I mean, is it too simplistic to look at it as a form of tribalism within the greater communities about trying to sort of mark your territory?
I think there is an element of that there. Again, like, thinking of the male Comic-Con fans who would like really opposed to Twilight coming into that area, that I think is a sense of kind of protecting this space. And in some respects, I think that could come from this kind of long-standing history within science fiction fandom, that science fiction fans have been denigrated, they've been othered, they're seen as just these weirdos. So when you've got a very mainstream text like Twilight invading that space, for want of a better word, the barriers go up. So you kind of like, well, no, this is my space. I want to protect my space because historically I haven't had this space, which, white men, you can't really make that argument very well, that there is that sense of boundary protection. And you do get that a lot in fandoms. And again, like I mentioned earlier, if you've got a text that you have this really strong connection with, if someone comes in and starts maybe criticizing it, you do kind of take it personally. So you kind of don't want these people saying these things about your fandom. But there's also, which I think we see in the One Direction schism, this sense of almost legitimate identity. So One Direction, obviously, they are a boy band. They are a manufactured boy band, so they're already kind of at the bottom end of the hierarchy in terms of music. They're pop. They are not,
they're up there with the Monkeys. I mean, come on.
Yeah, but they're not kind of the perhaps what connoisseurs of music might find highbrow. So there's that to begin with. They are followed by teenage girls who we've already seen are very much treated as these hysterical, emotional females who can't control themselves. And One Direction is well aware of this, that they're not immune to stories in the press about, these crazy teenagers. So when you've got one faction of the fandom openly shipping two characters, they're real people, albeit, real people with a persona. So you've got fans who are shipping them, they're openly shipping them. So they're tweeting about Harry and Louis. They are kind of spreading these conspiracy theories that they are actually together, but the management are stopping that from being public because it'll affect their popularity, stuff like that. And it also makes its way into kind of wider discourse. So there's kind of far more discussion in the press about, oh, look at these crazy girls shipping these two boys. So when you have that happening within your fandom and it's very, very visible, you want to distance yourself as members of that fandom. You're like, well, no, we are legitimate fans. We're not these crazy people that think Harry and Louis are together. So there's that sense of we are legitimate fans. We have got a legitimate identity because we perform acceptable fan behaviour. These people are not performing acceptable fan behaviour, so they should be, critiqued and denigrated and, slagged off on social media. So there's a lot of different things going on there. I think that there is an element of tribalism and we can think about it in that way. But there's also a huge amount in terms of kind of this historical image of fandom, the kind of different legitimate behaviours, the genders of the people involved as well. And you can see that with male fans of My Little Pony. They are seen as weirdos.
No, I mean, this was something that I had never encountered until I saw someone's tweet the other day about how they were never going to forgive men for what they'd done to My Little Pony. And I wasn't aware about the memes and the pictures, and then I googled, and I kind of regret going down. I mean, I shouldn't have been surprised.
No.
And I probably wasn't massively surprised, a little bit disappointed, but I had no idea that there was this kind of fetishization culture around
there is, but that is the very extreme end, and unsurprisingly, that is what the press will pick up on, because it is extreme. You know, you do have like legitimate male viewers of My Little Pony who like it because, you know, it's a nice show that highlights empathy and friendship, and, you know, things that still we kind of almost make fun of men for. You know, if a man is too emotional, then he's a sissy. You know, he's not a real man. And that discourse plays, I think, into like male fans of My Little Pony. Not at the extreme end, but certainly I think with the kind of the general male viewer who just wants to see a nice show about friends.
Well, presumably there wouldn't be an issue with a grown woman collecting My Little Pony memorabilia and watching the show.
No, there was an issue with the Twilight moms. So
Okay.
So there was when the Twilight films came out, they were a group of like older female fans who would sort of, I guess at that point they'd been in like the 30s, 40s. They were mums, and they kind of, you know, would go to the cinema, go to red carpet events, whatever, hold up their Team Edward, Team Jacob banners, and they were very, very much criticised for lusting after young men, and I can't remember how old the actors were at the time, but there was that whole issue of, you know, if this was a man doing this, he'd be called a pervert. Fair enough. But again, it is not appropriate behaviour. So women who are, you know, in their 30s, in their 40s, they are clearly too old for sex. They shouldn't be thinking about that. They shouldn't find these men attractive, and they certainly shouldn't be holding banners outside of cinemas kind of highlighting the fact that they're Team Edward. So again, it's this kind of this idea of appropriate behaviour, and it was one of the big things around 50 Shades of Grey, you know, that was being called mummy porn, because older women were kind of, and not even older women sometimes, but were kind of reading these books and kind of being able to discuss and talk about their own sexuality. But, you know, women aren't allowed to watch porn. What are we talking about? You can't do that. You're a woman. It is not allowed. So there are all of these appropriate things or ideas of appropriate behaviours for certain ages, certain genders, certain racial groups or whatever, that come into play when we start thinking about gatekeeping and boundary maintenance and identity and stuff.
I mean, I'm aware that you know, I said to you we're only going to be an hour and we might run slightly over now. So if you're okay with carrying on talking to me, there's a few other bits and pieces, because I mean, like, there's a whole load of stuff, and you've written very, very widely in this, and you're very immersed in this. But there are issues as well that I think it's useful for us to have some sort of conversation around. So one of the things that you have approached in your writing and your research has been some of those controversial areas of fandom. I remember, for example, whenever you put out your put out an appeal trying to speak to fans of oh gosh, that pop group with the,
Lost Prophets.
Lost Prophets, that's the one.
With Ian Watkins.
Yeah. Which at the time, I mean, so for anyone out there who's not aware about the Lost Prophets, I mean, Ian Watkins, who was their lead singer, was convicted on the only way I can put it is heinous child abuse crimes, and that created all kinds of issues for what I hadn't realized was quite a sizable fan community for that band and for that music, plus a band who no longer knew what they were doing with their music because suddenly their life's work has been thrown out the window. And you were kind of interrogating how the fan community responded to that. And I mean, that's a very extreme example of something that we're seeing more and more of within fandom, within what we always end up referring to as problematic creators.
Yes.
Because, I mean, fair enough, people deserve a fair trial. Ian Watkins was fairly tried and convicted.
Yeah.
There are a lot of allegations get made. We're in the Me Too generation now, which has been, you know, a fundamental seismic shift in terms of how we navigate some of our fan spaces, in terms of how professional conduct is assessed, in terms of how some of those relationships between fandom and the creators are also assessed, and also some of the artwork. You know, we're looking at people, and some artwork is artwork and films and books is now deemed as no-go territory by some by all. and being a fan of someone who is a problematic creator can have you be as cancelled as somebody else.
Yeah.
I mean, this is obviously, this is a freaking hour-long topic in its own right. But like, what the hell do you do with that? I mean, how has that changed what you're doing as a researcher? I mean, and how have you had the experience of your own fandoms altered by this?
Touch wood, I haven't, and hopefully I won't. But it was something that came to mind when the story first broke, because like Lost Prophets were a band from 11 miles down the road from me. They were from Pontypridd, Breed, and they were a really successful South Wales rock band. So when it came out, I was kind of thinking about, oh my God, first of all, there's that kind of national identity element to it. They're relatively local. They've in some respects put Wales on the map in the music scene, and they were very, very successful. But as a fan, I'm like, I've got tattoos from various different properties that I'm fans of. I've got an X-Files tattoo, obviously, but I've also got lyrics from my favourite band. And I was like, shit, what would happen if that was my favourite band? Like, how would I feel? Particularly when it comes to music, because music is so emotive. And for a lot of people, we connect with music in ways that we don't connect with TV or books or stuff like that.
Yeah.
And particularly the genre of music that Lost Prophets were in, kind of sort of that emo rock kind of genre, does typically attract people who, I might say, kind of feel extensively. So when you've got a connection to that music and it becomes part of your identity and you associate yourself with it so strongly and so deeply, how the hell do you react to the frontman of that band just performing these absolutely vile acts? And that's what got me interested, because I was just like, I do not know how I would react to this. But also, and understandably, the victims in this case needs to be the main focus. There has to be an investigation into what happened so that we can, enact justice for the victims. Yeah. Which I do not dispute at all. But within that, kind of the voices of fans sort of get left out. And there's a sense, unlike when a celebrity dies and you can grieve, you can mourn online in particular online spaces, and you can share that grief with others who feel the same way. When we have things like the Ian Watkins case happen, when we have things like some of the stuff coming out of Me Too, the focus moves from fans because it has to focus on the victims. But it means that fans don't have a space to talk about their own feelings. And those feelings are legitimate, even if perhaps to a different degree. Like, I don't want to say a lesser extent, but there is a different degree. All things are relative. And if you are a fan of Lost Prophets and you haven't actually been affected by, any child abuse, you don't know the people that were involved in this. The thing that affects you is the loss of your fandom, the loss of this text that means a huge amount to you. So that's what I was really interested in. And I kind of compared it to some of the work that's been done on Michael Jackson, because obviously there were allegations there. Jackson kind of never went to trial. It was settled out of court. So sorry, my cat has just come upstairs. So there's this sense that actually fans can still be fans of Michael Jackson because nothing was ever made official. So when Jackson died, people could grieve, and they could grieve in online spaces, and that was absolutely fine. But Lost Prophets fans couldn't do that. So I was interested in kind of how they were performing their fandom, if they were performing it at all, after the Watkins trial and conviction. And also how it made them reflect on their fandom. Like, could they still listen to the music knowing what he had done? And it was really interesting, the kinds of like tactics and sort of rationalizations that fans were making. So some of them were like, I don't listen to any of it. No, I can't. It's tainted. If he was the drummer, maybe I could listen to it, but he was the lead singer. I can't. Others kind of say, well, the band wasn't just Ian Watkins. It was a group effort. they all, put themselves into creating this music, and it's not fair that the others should be penalised just because of Ian Watkins. And then others kind of took this really negotiated stance. So there were a couple of people who said, rumours were circulating about Watkins in the fandom for a long period of time before these allegations came out. So I will listen to the music up to the point of the initial rumours, but I won't listen to anything after that because we kind of know he was being really dodgy. And I find that a really sort of interesting justification for what things we will listen to and what things we won't listen to. And we see that in debates coming out with Me Too, like Joss Whedon is a really good example because, Buffy is an amazing text. And it is understandably really kind of heartbreaking for fans to now be faced with the idea that Joss Whedon actually is a bit of a dick. But Buffy isn't just about Joss Whedon. There are all of the cast, there's all of the crew, there's different writers, different showrunners for different seasons. It's very much a group effort, probably more so than a band is, because it's such a large scale. So we then have to think about the ethics and the morals of, well, do we quantify this and say, well, okay, if Joss Whedon only, was involved for 10% of the entire run of Buffy, it's okay for me to watch it because the other 90% was made up of other people, and there are different ways that we start thinking about how and why we justify our involvement or our, ceasing involvement with these different fandoms.
I find it fascinating. We've talked about this before on our various shows and events in relation to Me Too and some of the problematic areas. Whenever it first came out, we did a show about this stuff. I mean, for instance, like for me, Roman Polanski is someone who I really struggle with.
Yeah.
I was always, I remember hearing stuff and I was a bit iffy. And then when I finally actually read the whole thing about what had gone on, that for me was my cutoff point. And I can just about watch his stuff before. And it literally is that thing. It's like I try to consciously avoid anything that's come since. But then you have someone like Woody Allen, whose films I, rightly or wrongly, I adore.
Yeah.
And then you got, who's somebody who has gone through a system and not been found against, and yet there is still a great number of people out there who, if they know that you like his films, will say, then I'm not talking to you and I'm shutting you down. And even me saying this on this podcast runs the risk of people sort of instantly clicking unfollow because how dare you like this person. But it's, where do you draw the line? I mean, we were talking briefly beforehand about Harry Potter, which is, we'll not go massively down that one, but it's the one that a lot of people are centering around at the moment, because of the comments that J.K. Rowling has said in relation to gender and the trans community. And that has caused a lot of issues for folk who, fair enough, more and more of them are seeing more and more of the problems within J.K. Rowling's writing anyway that were always there, never mind issues about trans. But I'm someone, I've put money into going to see Harry Potter World. Does that make me a bad person? How do I navigate that fandom? And I'm someone who's not really a Harry Potter fan.
Funny enough, I've just co-written a chapter with Simone Driesen about this for the book that we're co-editing on controversy, complicity and conflict in fandom. And we ran a survey where we were talking to people about kind of their general experiences with kind of problematic creators. But unsurprisingly, we did a lot of responses from Harry Potter fans. And those were really, really interesting. So some people said, well, I won't pay to go and see the films in the cinema, but I will pirate them. Like, I'm not going to give them my money, which fair enough. That is, I know I'm saying this on a podcast, but that is probably something that I will do. Like, I'm not going to pay to go and watch these films, but if I can get them via other means, then I'll do that. Other people were saying, well, it's a text that has a lot of people involved in it. And, some of those people, like, Emma Watson, Rupert Grint and Dan Radcliffe have all come out and been supportive of trans communities. So they very clearly, are on the opposite side of the spectrum to J.K. Rowling. So what happens with kind of them if we decide to like boycott the entirety of Harry Potter? We're not just boycotting Rowling. Obviously, there are issues around money because she's the rights holder. There's a lot of stuff going on there. But other fans would say things like, "Well, I'm going to keep reading the books. I bought the books years and years ago, and I love the books, so I'm going to keep reading them." Partly because, to some extent, once the books are released, the author's got no control over them. You can read those books and think whatever the hell you want, and Rowling can't stop you from doing so. And that's linked into some of the most interesting responses we had, which were, I am going to keep on writing Harry Potter fan fiction, but I'm going to specifically include gay and trans characters because I know J.K. Rowling hates it. So this is kind of my way of saying fuck you to Rowling in a really participatory context. So you remain involved in that fandom, but you do things deliberately because you know the creator isn't going to like it. And it's something that I struggle with, because up to a point I would have called myself a fan of Harry Potter. Now I am sort of reconsidering that label for myself. But I went to my MA graduation wearing a Ravenclaw tie because, of all the houses, I am Ravenclaw. I went to the Wizarding World of Harry Potter in Japan a few years ago, and I've got my own wands. So it is, and even though I kind of, wouldn't call myself a mega fan, certainly not to the extent of being a fan of the X-Files or The Walking Dead, I'm still kind of struggling with how do I now label myself, given I'm very, very opposed to what Rowling is doing and saying.
I mean, it sounds from what you're saying as well, though, that actually there is space within fandom to allow for those other approaches, to still be a fan of a work and to remodel it in a way that works for you.
Yeah.
Whilst not completely endorsing whatever's going on.
Yeah, I think it's almost like an ongoing series of complex negotiations. Particularly because, as people, obviously, we change over time. So our morals, our ethics, our behaviours and stuff will change over time anyway. There are some things that I won't do. I wouldn't give Rowling any more money. So I will not buy any more kind of Harry Potter texts or objects. I won't collect things anymore. But that's not to say that I wouldn't perhaps, go on eBay and buy a Time Turner necklace from someone secondhand. So there are different ways we can negotiate that, I think, while kind of vehemently opposing what the creator is saying. I think it's very easy, particularly on social media, to kind of break it down into extremes. And, we kind of touched upon this a bit earlier, and I am very fundamentally opposed to what Rowling says. I completely disagree with her, and I think she's just awful and should shut up, basically. So there are things that I don't think we can and should negotiate on. But the things that I think we shouldn't negotiate on are things that other people will say, well, yeah, we should negotiate on these. And, because people have different points of view, and you kind of never necessarily going to convert other people to what you believe, particularly on social media, where it's very easy to go into extremes within these discourses, rather than perhaps look at maybe some of the nuances and go, well, okay, yeah, as a queer teen, actually, the Harry Potter books meant a lot to me because I found my own sense of community, and I've grown up in this fandom that's really supportive of me. And you wouldn't want to lose that, regardless of what Rowling kind of says and the fact that, she is extremely transphobic. The things that the text have done for you have almost been done despite Rowling. She wrote them. But what they mean to you as a fan, we kind of make ourselves. We decide what influence the text is going to have. We decide how engaged we're going to become with it. And we decide what we are going to do with that text. And I think sometimes that nuance sometimes gets maybe overlooked in some of the broader conversations that should take place, but which kind of take place without really considering fans as complex communities, which they are.
Yeah. I mean, it's that nuance, I think, that's often missing, and it's the thing that is why I avoid certain conversations on social media, because it is something that, it feels like you need to sort of tease this out over a 30-minute conversation, not over 2 tweets.
Exactly.
That will be taken away and used to debate you, which is and fandom, I guess, is increasingly, for me, feels like a place that lacks nuance.
They can be. I think it depends on the platforms that we use as well. Like you said, with tweets, you are limited to the amount of characters you can use. And even if you've got a thread of 20 tweets, explaining your point of view, one of them is going to get highlighted and possibly misrepresent the entire argument. But if you are having a conversation in, like, I don't know, a subreddit dedicated to your fandom, you've got the opportunity to say a lot more, and to have kind of more in-depth debates. So I think some of it is kind of the platform affordances that maybe limit how much we can say, or the ways that people kind of respond to what we say. Whereas on other platforms, perhaps, there's that ability to discuss in more depth. Not in the same way that, you would in conversation. Like, even the stuff we've talked about in the last hour or so is wide ranging, and most of it we could probably talk for another few hours. You're not going to get that online, but yeah, there's need for nuance, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, look, you and I both know we could carry this conversation on indefinitely. So I don't want to take up any more of your time today, but I've thoroughly enjoyed having the chat about it. If people want to kind of connect with your stuff and your research, where should they go? So
my Twitter is @memories_child. So feel free to follow me there. I've also got links to various blog posts, open access articles on my website, which is bethanvjones.wordpress.com. And I'm quite happy to share articles. If they're not open access, just drop me a line on the contact form and I can send it over to you. Yeah.
Brilliant. And what's next for your research? What should we be looking out for in the near future?
So the edited collection I'm really excited about. That's gone off. So the proposal has gone off to Iowa Press, and we're waiting for kind of the review to come back from that. So hopefully that will be published maybe towards the end of next year. The journal special issue hopefully will be coming out around spring next year as well. So those, I know I'm biased because I'm involved. Those are going to have some really, really good chapters and articles in them. The X-Files book, which is looking at it's going to be published in readiness for the 30th anniversary. So that'll be published in August next year. And I'm also doing work on what I'm calling dark fandom. So I'm giving a couple of talks over the next couple of months looking at true crime fandom, and sort of investigative journalism, and maybe the extremes to which people investigate true crime stories using a sort of fanish lens. So yeah, there's a few different things I've kind of got coming up that I'm quite excited about.
I love the diversity of this stuff. I mean, it's such a relief. There's so much there. So I think there's probably, for anyone who's interested in stuff, you will find something, I guarantee you, in Bethan's work to merit further research, and hopefully start you off on some other fandomish journey. Bethan, hopefully this isn't the last time we chat to you. Hopefully we can have you on again at some point.
Definitely, that'd be really good.
This was great. Yeah. Folks at home, hopefully you've enjoyed today. Do give Bethan a follow. If you enjoyed the show, make sure you hit the subscribe button. Tell your friends about it. Don't forget we're on social media. We're on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. We're also on YouTube. So subscribe, add comments, tell us what you think. And we will catch you again very, very soon. Until then, cheerio.